My name is Gabriel Melendez, Director of the Center for Regional Studies at the University of New Mexico. I would like to welcome you all to one of our programs in the La Canoa Legacy Series, a partnership between the National Hispanic Cultural Center and the Center for Regional Studies. The Center for Regional Studies is dedicated to the creation and dissemination of knowledge about New Mexico, the Greater Southwest as a region, and its connections to northern Mexico, Latin America, and the Iberian Peninsula. The La Canoa Legacy Series takes its inspiration from the word canoa. A canoa is a sloop-rigged fishing boat, common in the Amazon, but in New Mexico it is the name of some common everyday tools, a simple canal or flute, or the wooden paddle a baker uses to move loaves of bread in and out of a hot oven. Always La Canoa receives and transports people and resources. And we want these talks to transport us and move the conversation between presenters and audience members back and forth in rich dialogue. We also want our talks to bring practical, useful information to community members, researchers, and others interested in the history, culture, politics, sociology, and religious experiences of our region.
Muchísimas gracias. It is truly an honor to be here with you all. You know, This place does mean a lot in terms of the work that I was able to do as a master's student in Latin American studies here, and how it was able to really provide a really solid foundation for the work that I was then able to build and depart from with my dissertation at the University of Texas at Austin. So you know, it's a homecoming in a way, and I'm very grateful to be able to share these words and to really dedicate them not just to my daughter, but also to all our Comanche relatives and those who are kind of in the struggle, but also those who are continuing to maintain their ways in such in such circumstances as we see even with our current political situations. So hopefully in this talk I'm going to try and read a little, talk a little, and sing a little, and hopefully there'll be some we'll have some good thoughts appear, hopefully, in those spaces. But to begin, I come from a place where the meaning of place means everything, where the terrestrial constellations of Pueblo nations comprise a distinctly indigenous multiverse, where utterances of decolonial thought have found fruitful fields for sprouting stalks of political autonomy and religious liberty that are continuing to be cultivated in such a good way and toward good ends. Indeed, I want to really give thanks for the tenacity, generosity, and selflessness of Pueblo relatives, for their strength to maintain their secular and sacred structures to fulfill their cultural and spiritual mandates, whose dictates come from a power far greater than the Spanish monarchy, the Mexican settler state, and the United States government. So as these 20 Pueblo nations continue to demonstrate to us all, really, they will be here because this is the place where they've always been and where they'll always be since and until time immemorial. And those relatives have really taught me a lot not just in terms of this work that I'm doing right now, but also understanding that as a non-Pueblo man, I also have other ways, and particularly I'm thinking about and keeping to those Comanche ways, and particularly wanting to follow those intellectual pathways of those Comanche ancestors to contextualize my own approach in a way that's purposeful and respectful. And particularly when thinking about and wanting to have the audacity to speak the names of those relatives who are no longer with us. So even as the official anthropologist of the Comanche Nation, Thomas Cavanaugh, even makes it clear that it's important for us to acknowledge these ancestors. And I really want to ask for forgiveness for naming them as I will within this presentation. And it's actually in that spirit that I want to read a little bit of actually the preface of an incredible book. I highly suggest you check it out. It's called The Life of 10 Bears, and it was written co-written by Thomas Cavanaugh, but really I think the brains behind it really is Francis Joseph Atokny. And so, it's there. Bueno, there we go. All right. So, Mr. Atokny writes, "We would never attempt to piece together a history of the Comanche tribe. Whatever we presented would not do justice to the strong, self-reliant, and able Comanche people who made our tribe's brilliant history. Furthermore, it would be beyond the capability of any modern researcher to properly present the great and adventuresome Comanches of the past. The researcher would have to have a knowledge of that very first Comanche who found these bountiful plains, who drove away the inhabitants, and who stayed here to steadfastly confront the vast dangers that are always present where there is a land of plenty. The researcher would also have to record that first Comanche who forked his limbs around a snorting, quivering mass of living horseflesh, thereby starting the movement that transformed his Comanches into the powerful horse people they are. He would have to record the Comanche as the first tribe to invade Mexico and successfully beat off the drilled and organized armies of that nation, the Royal Spanish armies, the imperial armies of Maximilian, and the armies of the Republic of Mexico. He would have to record the first Comanche to exultantly charge head-on into and engage in pitched battle with the blue-dressed cavalry soldiers of the United States of America. Comanches won glorious victories that still embellish proud Comanche history like precious jewels set in beautiful jewelry. Still, another formidable Comanche who must be properly represented was the first Comanche who braved the nerve-chilling, nightmarishly weird hallucinations known only to the novice eater of the sacred peyote plant. That cold-sweated Comanche gained today's soul-satisfying musical worship of that divinely created peyote plant, called by its true worshipers the, quote, will of the Creator, end quote. Although other peoples may have eaten peyote earlier, the present-day peyote religion is Comanche in origin. Comanche peyote music is by far the most imitated Indian music in America. And I think without doing a disservice to Mr. Atokny, I kind of want to end, I think, with what he, really with his words in terms of thinking about what my perspective and really my approach to this is when he says, none of these Comanches are figments of the imagination, although they are near mythical and unknown to some present-day Comanches. They all lived and breathed as surely as the patient and dear reader. They lived so that when history finally found them here on these lovely plains, that same history took written note of them for the sake of historical truthfulness. Their beautiful language and their almost too unbelievable achievements still live and pulsate in the hearts and on the minds and tongues of their direct descendants, the Comanches of this present day. So really, what does Comanche history look like to the modern day? And particularly when you bring that idea into context with particularly the notion of giving BAQUE. Now, giving BAQUE, the way I've understood it, and perhaps others can kind of can clarify or disagree, or they have their own insights. But the way I always understood giving BAQUE was the idea of giving support, standing behind, or really, and I guess to kind of really dig our fingers into it, that it constitutes and it is constitutive of one's relations and what those responsibilities and the reciprocities of those responsibilities to those relatives. And so in that way, when you give BAQUE, you're there, it's almost like, kind of like giving skina, dando skina, like when you're there to give BAQUE, you're there to support, but you're there not as the aggressor. You are there to support those who are doing such good things. And so to give BAQUE in a place like southern New Mexico, which is known historically as a place that is sort of absent of indigenous peoples, we also have to think about the idea that, in particularly this idea of hemispheric indigeneities, where really around the globe, indigenous peoples have had, and they really continue to have, distinctively varied histories and experiences with colonialism and empire. So New Mexico really presents a bit of an anomaly for folks in critical indigenous studies who are intending to bring this new subdiscipline that is being built called critical Latinx indigeneities, and that research and scholarship into dialogue with pre-existing political, cultural, and intellectual projects relating to the distinctive characters of indigenous peoples. But when we're talking about New Mexico in particular, we have to acknowledge that Pueblo peoples have had their own secular and sacred systems of governance. And so, while certainly not intending to discourage that, I think the incredible potential that I think that this conversation has, there's also a need to diversify our conceptual understandings of both Native America and Latin America, and within a sphere of what is now New Mexico. And so this idea of thinking of New Mexico as a thoroughfare of these two kind of seemingly antithetical spaces, it has to be done in a good way, and it has to give deference, I would argue, to indigenously self-determined political futures that are being enacted, that are continuing to be enacted and embodied across these settler-inspired spectrums of recognition. So simultaneously, we also have to be mindful of the fact that there are distinct registers of white supremacy that are really structuring that idea of recognition, and particularly when we're thinking about it in New Mexico's history, where we have 3 different colonial sovereigns laying claim to this space. And so while those enunciations have kind of gone through these different these different historical periods, we still see Pueblo peoples being able to maintain their ways, so that way you and I, and that we can have such good rain here, and that we can be able to celebrate this place that is truly their world. So it's kind of important that when we're wanting to, and so I want to actually focus here on, and this image right here is an incredible mural done by a Dene Awalatoa artist named Sabas, and it's incredible because this is actually right next to the campus of New Mexico State University, so my alma mater, go Aggies. But what I find to be really beautiful is not only Sabas, his really the intentionality of wanting to blur those lines between kind of the contemporary and the historical, but particularly wanting to bring indigenous voices, perspectives, and really struggles to the forefront. Like I said, in a space like southern New Mexico, where it's only seen as a space of, where its focal point is more towards Mexico, and rightly so. I mean, it shares the border, and yet I find Sabas his work to be incredibly powerful because, as we can see here, so. Right there is, the Oregon Mountains is what he's trying to depict, and for those that had kind of been following, the Oregon Mountains were recently designated as a national monument, right? And yet, and I don't know if you can see it kind of well here, but he puts up, on a wooden sign, and he identifies it actually by its historical name, which is La Sierra de los Mansos. Mansos and Manso people are still there. In fact, and I'm very blessed to be able to know those peoples, as well as be able to learn from their histories as well. And so by no means are the Mansos extinct. By no means have they gone away, and yet we still see kind of this kind of mentality of being able to impose place names onto a space that for the Mansos is actually quite sacred, and even Spanish colonists, when they were coming up in 1598, they identified it as La Sierra de los Mansos. So if it has to have some kind of a name, which in the Manso language, it probably has its own distinctive place name, but I found Sabas that critique to be really beautiful because it's essentially saying, no, indigenous peoples have been here and that they'll continue to be here in spite of what the federal government tries to do to create these different landmarks, right? But we also need to understand that, as he puts right here in this, with water is life, right? So he's talking about the Rio Grande, and the Rio Grande being this really an international water space, an international body of water that is far greater than what we think about within kind of ideas of U.S. indigenous identity politics, and I think Saba, his willfulness to connect the idea of New Mexico water struggles with that of our Lakota relatives still fighting at Standing Rock, in the No Dapple movement. I think again this space is not something that people have seen, and so it's quite powerful to have those voices essentially bring those conversations into a space where indigeneity is seen as kind of a hushed conversation at best. But in that same way of thinking about these waters, we also have to understand that in this case, this little boy here, he embodies this idea of indigenous transnationalism, really, and how those bodies, they bear distinct characters when they are situated within what I argue is what we are surrounded by and what we are continue to benefit from as really this indigenous multiverse, also known as New Mexico. And yet we also know that there are far more other peoples than just Pueblo peoples here. Of course, we know that the Spanish came up in 1598. We know that the United States invades this space in 1846, and yet, so there's these layers upon layers upon layers of history that in this space are sort of seen as, they're understood in a different way. And what I'm hoping for is when we, so going into this idea of a cosmography, and particularly thinking about cosmographies of native New Mexico, we're able to really problematize, I think, something that, especially in that space where you are surrounded by Border Patrol checkpoints where ICE is partnering with the Doña Ana County Sheriff's Department to raid schools for young children. Indigeneity has a very peculiar relationship to this landscape. And yet, I think what's important is when I bring up this idea of cosmography. It was actually something that I had read in this really old book. It was like this small little pocket book written by Harlow Shapley, I believe. Harlow Shapley. He was an emeritus professor in practical astronomy at Harvard, and he wrote this book, essentially kind of talking about what were the most pressing issues of astronomy and astrophysics at that time. And so when he talks, he presents this idea of cosmography, and it was truly kind of he's thinking about it through the lens of orientation. So like a compass, we see where north is, and but also we know that a compass its magnetism can be changed, right? When you put a magnet to it, you can change where that needle goes. And so Harlow, or rather I should say Dr. Shapley, the way he describes cosmography is he says cosmography is to the cosmos as geography is to the earth. And so when we think about a cosmography, I wanted to kind of put that into context of what we think, or what, actually this recent 3D map of our nearby universe. And so in this case, this image is spanning over 600 million light years. And so it shows the Milky Way right there. And what's kind of great about, when these astrophysicists and, different astronomers are mapping our universe is that wherever someone is, they are always in the center of their universe. And so in this case, thinking about the Milky Way and its relationship, and particularly being on the edge of what is known as like this, the Virgo kind of supercluster. So all these galaxies, you know, and the gravitational pull that's kind of clustering them together. And yet, we also know that the universe is expanding, right? We also know that it's going to continue to expand. And yet, we see right here, we see that there is a local void. We see that, you know, that there is a force of gravity that is pushing these galaxies essentially to cluster together in a specific way. And so kind of juxtaposing that idea of a local void onto the idea of New Mexico, and particularly, I pulled this map off of from the New Mexico Health Department, so showing all of the tribal nations whose reservation lands are situated within the state of New Mexico. It seems like we see a local void going down south and going to the east. And those were also spaces that were also known as primarily Comanche spaces. They were also known historically as Apache spaces. And indeed, you know, this map is actually quite dated because, you know, obviously just to the west of Las Cruces on I-10, you know, the Fort Sill Apache were able to, they were able to acquire land and brought that land into federal trust in order to build a reservation community in their ancestral homelands. So even then, you know, this map is, you know, is not necessarily reflective of what indigenous peoples are doing in those spaces, but also where they've been and where they're going to continue to be. And indeed, you know, like I think even farther, a little bit further south, you know, that's where El Paso is, and that's where Isla del Sur is, excuse me, and that's where it was founded in 1682. So this space, but like I said, you know, this space is like, just compare the sort of absence of what we think of as indigenous political bodies in the South to what we see really as this clustering of Pueblo nations up north. And of course, those nations have been able to maintain those, you know, maintain their presences in those spaces for quite some time. But like I said, what I'm hoping to do in this talk is really to complicate and clarify the South in terms of its relationship to these conversations of indigeneity. And what I'm hoping to do is actually to provide it through a context of Comanchería. So the map on the left is one that comes from Isidro Vizcaya Canales in his 1968 book, La Invasión de los Indios Bárbaros al noreste de México en los años de 1840 y 1841. So this book was actually published it's del Instituto Técnico de Monterrey, and yeah, it's an incredible book, but it's specifically talking about sort of the relationships that the Comanches had, and in this case, you know, the way they were pushing down into Nuevo León, into Coahuila, and you know, actually pushing as far south as San Luis Potosí and Zacatecas. And yet we have on the right a map by Thomas Cavanaugh from his incredible book, The Comanches, A History from 1706 to 1875. What I find to be probably the most apparent kind of difference between these two maps, really, you know, one kind of being produced within a Mexican context and another within a U.S. intellectual context, is how, you know, Isidro's work, you know, he borders what Comanchería can look like. Particularly, he's, you know, in situating Comanche spaces outside of the Mexican nation state. And yet we also know, and that's, I mean, that was precisely the point of his book, which was to show that Comanches were in Nuevo León and they were, you know, making males the way that they were. And yet, you know, their presence there was not seen as being natural, or more importantly, it was not seen as being a distinctly Mexican indigenous space. And yet, I think the map on the right, and you know, I think Dr. Cavanaugh's, I find that map to be more, I don't know, I dig that map more because I really appreciated the willingness to not kind of lump Comanches all into one specific space, but instead acknowledging that there were multiple political bodies of Comanches that were operating in different places at different times. And so in this case, the body or the band that my relatives belonged to are the Yamparicas, and so on the northern part of sort of what we would think as Comancheria, and yet, like I said, Comanches really problematize this idea of whether the United States had claim over what we think about indigeneity, and particularly nomadic native peoples, but also problematizing the idea that Comanches all marched to the same drumbeat, as you will. So particularly, I found Dr. Kavanaugh's work, thinking about this idea of international diplomacy and Comanche international diplomacy, to be quite thought-provoking, because what he essentially does, in this book, this book is just massive and it's awesome, and he does an incredible amount of archival work, and so I decided to focus on this one specific part of the text where he looks at it. So this is in 1825, and so these military commanders in San Miguel del Vado, which by this time was identified as a Genízaro community. So in September 8th, 3 Comanche diplomats, Chimal Colorado, Vicente, and Genízaro, visited San Miguel del Vado on the Pecos River. And so several days later, then another guy named El Baston comes in, and effectively the Mexican government has to hit up San Miguel del Vado for essentially to meet the treaty obligations that the Mexican government had negotiated with this particular body of Comanches. And then later, it's in December that when Chimal Colorado, Vicente, and Genízaro again visit San Miguel del Vado, and as he says, without incident. But I guess, not to say that I didn't think that that he was right, or that his analysis was wrong by any means, but I kind of wanted to see what it looked like for myself. So I actually found the documents, and it's pretty friggin' awesome, because we have the alcalde of San Miguel del Vado, and like I said, I don't want to get too crazy into the orthography here, but sabes que it's El Capitán Vicente Genízaro in Chimal Colorado. In the middle document is kind of the second enunciation of these 3 Comanche diplomats going to negotiate those treaties, or this treaty in particular. But I want to kind of pose and perhaps we can think about this as a little bit more participatory if you want, but I kind of want to dust off my Mexican history here. So, when does the Plan de Iguala, when is it negotiated, or when is it essentially promulgated? Do you know when the Plan de Iguala was founded or it was established? It's in 1821, right? Okay, so 1821, and the Plan de Iguala is essentially the key document that the Mexican government utilizes to erase the capacity for Genízaro existences within this space. And yet here we have the precise, I guess what we would call it is we have a forthright articulation of Genízaro identity within an indigenous political context. Something, and so I keep thinking about this moment when these three Comanche diplomats go into San Miguel del Vado, and particularly I'm thinking about Tomás Sena and what his reaction was when you have this Comanche guy saying, "No, you're going to call me Genízaro." He's essentially making them believe in ghosts, making them enunciate the very thing that they can't enunciate. And he's doing it in a very purposeful way. And I think in particular, by showing, for example, that Genízaros can exist within the Comanche nation, within the Comanche political sphere, it problematizes even, I think, what current research is talking about Genízaro studies and Genízaro identity scholarship. Because I think for the longest time, it's been presumed that the only way that Genízaro bodies could exist was through the Spanish crown, or through, and in this case, kind of, at the same time, kind of the sort of erasure of that within the Mexican settler state. And yet, this guy insisted on being identified as Genízaro. He could have picked any name. He could have picked any name that he wanted to. And, you know, I'm sure, but it seems, and and then the second point that I want to make about this moment is that where they are going is San Miguel del Vado, which is itself seen as a Genízaro space by this time. So, you know, San Miguel del Vado is founded in 1818, or that's kind of what then the land-grant documents talk about, and it was specifically seen as a space that was distinctly Comanche in its sort of tribal affiliation. And yet, here's this dude, Genízaro, going into San Miguel del Vado as a Comanche. And I think equally, what I find to be really powerful is that it is San Miguel del Vado having, so in this case, a Genízaro community, having to fulfill the obligations of the Mexican settler state. So it problematizes the idea that Mexico, or that rather that Genízaro communities, you know, in this case, were operating, or rather, it shows that Genízaros had very different political ideas, and that the political projects, both individually and collectively of Genízaros, both whether we're thinking about it on the individual basis or on the community basis, cannot be lumped into just one specific category. And so by showing you all that, and in this case, showing, and we have to think about where we can find these articulations of Genízaro political presences within indigenous spaces that are not bound by the United States' concept of what indigeneity looks like. And so, and ironically, we're having to go to the Archivo Histórico Militar in Mexico to find these. And in this case, I brought this document up just to show that Chimal Colorado was already known to Mexico and well before he comes in this, or in September. And in fact, so this document shows him being, being essentially on the radar of New Mexico and of New Mexico military commanders, in July of the same year. But there are other documents, and sadly I wasn't able to find them. But Hubert Bancroft talks about the same Chimal Colorado being known by Spanish colonial authorities in New Mexico as early as 1809. So when we're thinking about Comancheria, again, I kind of want us to really problematize this Mexican sort of context of where Comanches could be. Because what we're showing, and really what we see within these documents, and particularly not just within these documents, because I think what's quite beautiful is that even within these very spaces and within, so in fact I was in Tortugas a few days ago for their feast day, and even within those families there are stories of Comanches, and particularly of those families coming from Comanche families. And again, this space is not seen as having any sort of indigenous sort of history, really. It's seen as kind of voided of it, and instead kind of, again, the focal point being more towards Mexico. But in a further effort to really kind of complicate and clarify this idea of Comancheria really being much more expansive than I think we give, than really what we give our ancestors credit for, is looking at particularly these two documents right here. So the one on the left, is actually a declaration of war by the state of Chihuahua against the Comanche Nation in 1831. And then the document on the right is actually a peace treaty with both the Comanche and Kiowa nations in 1834, both being negotiated with the state of Chihuahua and not with the Mexican federal government. So that really problematizes the way we think about indigenous political relationships and the way that indigenous peoples interacted with, I think in this case, Mexicanos in particular. and how, in this case, we see it is not the Mexican federal government taking responsibility for public safety, but instead it is the state governments, so not just Chihuahua, but also Sonora, Nuevo León, Tamaulipas, and Coahuila in particular, and they are the ones that are instituting scalping laws in the 1820s and 1830s, and so paying, and it wasn't even Mexican citizens who they were paying. I mean, they were essentially hiring mercenaries to go and scalp Comanches, and they got a pretty penny for it. But in what is quite, I think, important for us to think about is that Comanche political bodies were independently thinking about what they wanted their relationships to be in these spaces. And I think what is particularly powerful is that the next year, so in 1835, is when the United States thinks that it negotiates its first treaty with the Comanche Nation, which is kind of not necessarily the case, because really what it is it's the federal government, the United States federal government, having to essentially serve as the middle guy between, and it's really a treaty between the Comanches and Kiowas on one end, and essentially all of the tribes, the southeastern tribes in particular, that were getting brought on the Trail of Tears. So we see Comanches articulating very different political visions in a way that have not been understood, or that at least in this part of this part of the world have been seen as being quite absent. And so it's kind of sad that we have to go into kind of Mexican archives to really validate the oral histories that exist within these communities, because to me, those knowledge spaces are just as valid as what we see Mexican military commanders writing in the 1830s. But if this allows for us to think about different indigenous peoples being able to negotiate and being able to establish political relationships with settler colonial powers in a way that do not necessarily meet what we think now as as federal Indian policy, I think it gives us an understanding that indigenous peoples were incredibly creative, and they were incredibly purposeful in the way they wanted to negotiate, and in the way they wanted to relate to these landscapes. So to really hammer home this point of the kind of this obsession that I think Mexicanos really had with Comanches is that I found this incredible document. It's called the Vocabulario del Idioma Comanche. And it was written in 1865. And it was published by La Sociedad Mexicana de Geografía y Estadística. So kind of like, I guess it would be our version of National Geographic. But in this case, this particular group, or this particular organization was founded with, and kind of its founding principle was actually to map out Mexico's northern frontier. So it had a reason, not just for wanting to think about what the North might look like, but it was very purposeful that it would be this organization that would then be the ones to take the lead, essentially, in wanting to develop a document that shows and really talks about translating Comanche concepts into Spanish. But as you'll see, so not on this, but right here. So in this page, we see a lot of different things. But one, I think what's quite powerful is seeing an expression of Comanche orthography, which and thinking about how Comanches had their own sort of numerical systems and they had their own writing systems in a way that Mexicanos were really curious about. And I think they really wanted to penetrate. But in this case, 1865, you still have Comanches pushing down into Chihuahua, still raiding. And so in this case, this document ends up being the product of essentially of interrogations by Comanche captives, in particular one, and I don't know if you can see, it's right below, so it's right, yeah, so hijo, here. So It's right below here, but it says, explicación que da el cautivo Andrés. There were two captives who ended up being the source base for Mr. Garcia Rejon, and the way in which he then developed this dictionary as a way, again, it was not what we think of like an ethnographic thing. This had a military objective. This was a military document, and so what I find to be quite fascinating is the way that then they define the idea of puja, and in this case, they define puja as la bruja, and puja for Comanche is very different, and yet we see that already within a Mexicano consciousness, we see, or at least within the document that this, again, that is being generated by interrogations with captives, is that we see this transformation in puja being Comanche power. It's literally the idea of power or medicine, and puja instead being actually, it's so not only being seen as already having a negative quality to it, but then also having a gendered quality to it. And so in New Mexico, so enunciando el poder Comanche, right? So it's a Nuevo Mexicano power trip, is that, and I actually have to thank Dr. Garcia, David Garcia, for pointing me in this direction, because, as late as 1908, El Independiente, so a newspaper published in Las Vegas, published this piece called Nuevo Mexico en el año de 1950. And essentially what this is, it's kind of like a prophecy, really. It's a prophecy of New Mexico. So written in 1908, this piece is written as sort of a prophecy of what New Mexico is going to look like in 1950. And essentially what this document shows is it's showing Nuevo Mexicano intellectuals essentially saying that, well, because essentially white people are so enamored with native peoples that white senators from back east decide to change the name of New Mexico from New Mexico to El Estado de Pujacante. And the way that Rubén Cobos, so the most kind of famous Mexican sociolinguist of New Mexico Spanish, so he writes, a dictionary of New Mexico and Southern Colorado Spanish. He defines Pujacante as a witch doctor. And so the very enunciation of Comanche power already translates into something that is antithetical to a settler idea or a settler-inspired vision of this space. And it's important that we understand that, because it transforms, I think, the fact that indigeneity was much more diverse than I think we give it credit for, and particularly the ways that Comanche power was seen as sort of the antithesis of what civility was, of what we think today as New Mexico. And I think in the way that these writers articulate is that it is seen as something that is antithetical to a Nuevo Mexicano vision, and a political vision in particular. So I think, again, when we're looking at the southern border, there's something about it that is quite, not provocative, but I think there's something that is quite telling, in that there is a lack of understanding of these histories. And it seems, in a way, it's quite purposeful. And yet, to the point where we even have nonprofit organizations like the North American Border Plex, who are actively trying to talk about economic development, and they're trying to talk about how, the El Paso, Las Cruces, Ciudad Juarez, that sort of triangulation of this borderplex is seen as solely dependent upon it being, and it is indicative of a vibrant, and what it talks about at the very end of this is that a vibrant binational and bilingual culture. And yet, in November of 2019, I actually had the honor of being invited to attend a meeting of the Southern Pueblos Council in Isla del Sur, which is in El Paso. And Isla del Sur speaks Tiwa, and they're doing some great work to essentially to bring that and to revitalize that language. So, okay, so we have Tiwa, right? So that already kind of problematizes the idea of a binational and bilingual border region, right? Then we also have Comanchería starting to manifest itself in southern New Mexico through the Fort Sill, through the Mescalero, and also to the Chihine Inde nation of New Mexico. And what I think is quite a conversation that has been often sort of sidelined is also thinking about indigenous peoples in Ciudad Juarez, and particularly thinking about urban Rarámuri communities, and particularly the fact that this urban Rarámuri community, so the Colonia Tarahumara, electing an all-female governance council. And it is this governance council that has been actually one of the most adamant in contesting Mexican settler statecraft in this space and essentially challenging the Mexican government's willfulness to assimilate Rarámuri bodies into the Mexican nation. And yet, we also see, in a Washington Post article in June of 2018, was that it is within this space, in Chihuahua in particular, where they have Latin America's only indigenous prison. And it was because of Rarámuri leadership that they were able to independently establish a prison that allows Rarámuri men to be able to essentially being able to, how do I put it? It is a different vision of what criminal justice can look like. Instead of it being punitive, but in this case, in the Rarámuri case, where Rarámuri were being discriminated against because of their language, because of their cultural practices, because of who they were as Rarámuri, and particularly because of when they were being targeted by drug cartels, they were essentially finding themselves in these prisons in Chihuahua that are themselves ran by the cartels. And so what the Rarámuri did was they effectively and successfully petitioned the state government in Chihuahua that they could be able to found their own prison. And in this case, a prison that allows these young men to be able to speak their language, to be able to participate in their healing traditions, and to be able to practice their cultural traditions in a way that they were never able to in Mexican prisons. And I would highly suggest, if you all are more interested in thinking about Rarámuri and looking at just how effective they've been in fighting on behalf of their people, you should check out this article at the very least, because it's brilliant. And yet, in this same space, we have these overtly racist caricatures of Tarahumara identity, and particularly coming through the lens of soccer. And so it is quite fascinating that then it would be the Plex, essentially promoting the resuscitation of a Mexican soccer team, which was the Indios up until 2012, and instead they were able to get the club license from a university in Puebla, and but I think they're getting a different name. But these are things that are not historical. These are quite real, and these are quite apparent in terms of thinking about the challenges that Rarámuri face. But even as a kid myself, I remember going to a soccer game. Actually, it was a soccer game between the El Paso Patriots and the Indios in Juarez, and I remember being so confused because I was like, "Shit, who should I cheer for?" It was kind of a crisis in a way. But I bring that forward because it is not just even within these ideas of indigenous cultural representation where brown bodies are being targeted in these spaces, but we actually see in this case, and I was going to read a little bit of an open letter, but I'm not sure if we have enough time. So, okay. Well, I'll condense this next part, and instead just talk about how, and particularly my good friend and colleague, Dr. Giovanni Batz, who's actually an incredible scholar. He's Guatemalteco in terms of what he was able to get, dual citizenship, but he himself is Quiché Maya and a transnational Maya from Los Angeles. And the work that he's doing right now with other Maya scholars in diaspora, and particularly calling out the gross human rights violations that the United States government, as well as Mexico and Guatemala, have inflicted upon Maya communities, it's atrocious in what they've been able to do. And yet, because of I think the dedication of Dr. Batz and his colleagues, we are finally able, and I think New Mexico is really able to benefit from his perspective and from showing that indigeneity moves well beyond the lens of a U.S. indigenous identity politics. So, and it is also within this space that, like in Tornillo, for example, where you had indigenous children being incarcerated and being separated from their parents, and yet it is the same logic that was used to separate Native kids from their parents and to send them to boarding schools. So again, I really have to thank the Murals of Las Cruces, this collective, for bringing these conversations to the forefront and for insisting that we acknowledge not only the femicidios in Ciudad Juarez, but connecting them to the missing and murdered indigenous women movement that is happening throughout Canada and here into the United States, showing that those things are not isolated, but that they are actually quite interconnected with the settler colonial logic that targets brown women. So, what does giving BAQUE look like? This is what I think giving BAQUE looks like. I think it looks like indigenous artists being able to express themselves in their ancestral ways and still understanding that their creativity is beautiful and that they can speak truth to power in a way that goes well beyond jargon, goes well beyond the scope of what even governments like to consider as what indigenous political visions can look like. And so it's actually indeed giving BAQUE, in my argument, I would argue, and what I'm hoping that my daughter, hopefully if she watches this someday, I want her to know that giving BAQUE looks like this, Hita. It means looking like being there for your relatives. And in that way, I actually want to sing a song as a way to sort of bring forth those good thoughts, and as well as end in a way that shows the visions of our ancestors and bringing them forth in a space where Comanches have never been acknowledged as being able to exist. So I'm going to sing a good song. sir.
I may have this pronunciation wrong, but you said that there was a special prison system, like, is it presumed in Chihuahua?
Yeah. Yeah, Raramuri. Yeah, Raramuri. I guess that's the indigenous term that, I guess what we know is the Tarahumara. That they call themselves Raramuri, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So you made an allusion that somehow the punishment system was different?
Yeah, so in this way, when it comes to this specific prison, is that from what I understand, and I kind of have to defer to some colleagues at New Mexico State. Actually, I was shared this idea, or that article in particular by Dr. Spencer Herrera at New Mexico State. But from what I understand, and again, I'd highly suggest you check out the Post article. But essentially, Raramuri men, when they don't go into the Mexican criminal justice system. In fact, the way that they are sent to these prisons is by the governance council of their communities themselves. And so in certain cases, Raramuri men are actually sending themselves without actually being convicted by their governance councils. They know that they did wrong. And so there are stories of these men traveling for days on foot to get to this prison and then essentially saying, no, hombre, like, I did wrong and I need to be in here. And so, and like I said, it's in this article where it has a beautiful, beautiful articulation of this idea where it's like a short video clip of essentially, so there's two Raramuri men sitting on the floor. One's playing a violin and another one's playing a guitar. And then, we don't see the face of the dancer, but there's a man dancing and he has huaraches and he has bells on his ankles. And just to see that is a very different kind of vision of I think, of rehabilitation rather than, I think, where even within a U.S. context where criminal justice and particularly these prison systems are seen as isolating the individual. And in fact, Raramuri, I would argue, are actually saying, no, it is precisely by bringing them into their ways, by grounding them in their cultural value systems, that they will be able to heal from these things. And that's a very different philosophy than I think what we understand as, a punitive, system that we have now that is, like it's a industrial complex in and of itself. But anyways, I hope that answers your question. Okay. Yes, sir.
Help me understand the term Genízaro.
Okay. Yeah.
I had thought that people that were ethnically indigenous that cooperated with the Spanish and later Mexican government traveled with them. Many came to New Mexico with Plan who were originally in tribes from central Mexico, Zacatecas, or many different places.
Right.
You seem to be using it more in terms of the Comanche community, but it must have included a lot of different tribal backgrounds.
Well, I don't want to ruin my dissertation for you, but because pardon?
Is it the same thing as Indigenous?
So I have to say that I dedicated an entire dissertation actually to not answering that question because when it comes to Genízaro identity, we have to acknowledge that it's a very complicated history, right? But the way I have understood it, coming from a community that has kind of had to identify itself as Genízaro and yet has been able to maintain its very distinctive kinship relationships with the Comanche Nation in particular, that we have to acknowledge that even within these Genízaro spaces, there are very different ideas of what Genízaro means. So for example, in the Pueblo de BAQUE, its focal point was much more towards the Navajo Nation, towards the Utes, towards the Great Basin, really. And one elder, and I would entirely agree, is that argued that BAQUE was the home to over 24 tribal nations. So Genízaro in BAQUE has a very different historical trajectory and really a legacy than what we see in the Taos Valley, and particularly in the community that I come from. And so. And yet, we also know that there were communities like Belén and like Carnué and others that were also identified as Genízaro. And I think the one you're referencing in terms of looking at indigenous peoples from central Mexico is, the Barrio de Analco, right? So the Barrio de Analco being founded by indigenous peoples from Tlaxcala. And, that's kind of the tricky aspect of Genízaro identity studies is that the way that it gets constructed is not necessarily by indigenous peoples, but it is instead imposed upon by, particularly by Spanish government officials as well as by priests in particular. So, and yet, these priests, there was even no standardization of like, well, if this person's Genízaro, then they must be Apache, and if this so the thing is that it depended even on the priests whether or not they even wanted to acknowledge someone's indigeneity to begin with. So there, like I said, the way that conversation is moving now, and the scholarship that's being produced, I respect it, and particularly, in terms of understanding the diversity of that experience, and yet I have significant issues with the way it's moving and the way that it is forcing other Genízaro communities in particular to have to adopt an idea that wasn't necessarily understood within those communities themselves. So there's a necessity for us to have to really be critical in the ways that Genízaro identity was articulated historically, because remember, Genízaro, just the very term, is not an indigenous term, right? It comes from Turkey, so it's a Turkish word, and then it finds its way through the Iberian Peninsula, through New Spain, and then it goes into New Mexico. But we also know that the system of indigenous enslavement was not just isolated to New Mexico, right? And in fact, there was one a cohort of historians in Arizona who sort of saw an equivalent in Sonora, or what they call the Pimeria Alta, as the Niforas. So they're technically seen as the same thing, and yet we only see in New Mexico we see that transformation of indigenous bodies into Genízaro, but it's through this kind of colonial idea of racializing indigenous bodies, which is sort of antithetical to the way that indigenous political visions have been articulated. So it's, like I said, it kind of defies a lot of many logics and a lot of things that we've really, the way that we've been taught our history here. And yet, like I said, working in ABQ, where there's a very different understanding of what that history is over there, and particularly now as they're moving forward with, talking about connecting and tying Genízaro identity to ideas of DNA and genetic science, it just emphasizes the point that Genízaro political bodies and visions are quite diverse, because those very same things are not present in Taos, where I'm from. And I would argue that Genízaro communities have the inherent right to determine their political destinies as they see fit. And yet we see sort of this co-optation of DNA science, which is really what I would argue is sort of just a repackaging of blood quantum. And that we know within tribal nations has been absolutely disastrous. So, now Genízaro communities are having to grapple with these things in a way that I think we haven't had the language to really to understand, let alone to conceptualize. And so as these scholars are kind of moving forward, I kind of have had to take the position that, they're going to do their thing and I'm going to do my thing, but, it's kind of I have to agree to disagree with those concepts, because those aren't what I was taught. And, if that mutual, if that respect that I have for ABQ, for example, is there, then that respect has to be reciprocated. And, that means that, not all of us are going to agree on everything, right? I think we can all, relatives can disagree, and they often do disagree. So, it's a very, yes, like I said, I don't want to ruin my dissertation for you, though. So.
We have time for about 2 more questions, so.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Gregorio, for covering, I think, the concept of indigeneity, one that resounds question, the answer to your question, because we're dealing with multiplicity of identities. But my comments have to do with Enrique Salazar and the name change controversy that you referenced. Enrique Salazar published El Independiente in Las Vegas for about 30 years.
Yeah.
And he issued a column, opinion column, once a week.
Hmm.
And one of those is Nuevo Mexico in 1950, New Mexico in 1950, which is what the item you referenced. I actually wrote an article called Nuevo Mexico by Any Other Name.
Yeah.
It appeared in Contested Homelands, that book.
That's appropriate.
So it has to do with 1906 and the Beveridge delegation coming from Congress to survey New Mexico
Right.
and determine whether it was worthy for statehood or not.
Right, right.
And so it's a modernist project, and the idea is to figure out what this state is like, what this territory is like, and of course, it comes down to interviewing people about their language. Do they speak Spanish? Do they speak English?
Right,
Can they speak English?
Right.
And then it's about proposals to make it acceptable to Congress so that this territory can go into the Union.
Right.
So as a result of that, this name change controversy comes up. And there are different proposals put forward as to what New Mexico should be in the future once it becomes a state.
Right.
So among the names are Moctezuma, Pujucante, the one you referenced, and
Right.
Lincoln. It's kind of really triculturalism in disguise.
Fascinating.
Anyway, but it's, so I think the affirmation that these journalists and Nuevo Mexicanos in particular are saying is it shouldn't change. It should stay Nuevo Mexico, which fortunately it has. And then there's a whole other part of that article of his futurist vision of the future that has to do with the Spanish-speaking population losing its social power in places like Taos, right?
Right.
So he says in 1950 in Taos, the natives are not going to be in the plaza, and they're not going to be in the old settlements. They're going to be dispersed out.
Right.
Well, just count the number of double-wide trailers that are out in the, in the periphery of Taos where you're from.
Right.
And
Right.
you can see the effect of that hegemony coming in. So he was also concerned with that, with what is going to be the future generally of
Right.
Mexico.
Right. No, thank you, Dr. Melendez. I really appreciate that. I think we're, and I'm really hoping to be able, to dig my fingers a lot more into that article because, especially again, the concept of Pujacante, I've been incredibly fascinated with it because, and especially thinking about, kind of blurring those lines between Mexico and actually connecting kind of Mexican political visions with kind of a Nuevo Mexicano kind of political project, right? And especially in its territorial days, right? And especially kind of how, it's the U.S., not the Indian Service, but essentially, but the Indian agencies here in New Mexico that, like John Calhoun in 1849 and 1851 is like arguing that, that Comanches should be, and they are, New Mexico Indians, right? So it's a very, like, it shows that even within this sort of critique that is kind of thinking about indigeneity specifically through a Pueblo lens, that there were even administrators and other indigenous peoples who were trying to problematize that narrative altogether. And so I think by trying to connect Pujacante with kind of a Mexican interpretation of Puja, it's more showing that Comanche, I think, movements and presences have been within kind of the Mexican nation state and that consciousness and that political sort of kind of national identity project far more, and it's far more important in terms of thinking about how Mexican citizenship is not actually developed in the Constitution. It's developed in the colonization laws of 1824, which are specifically designed to recruit Anglo settlers from Kentucky, Tennessee, and so, but essentially to check U.S. expansionism, right? And so, the way that Comanches essentially played off those different political projects is brilliant on one end, and yet it shows that they were not just isolated to the United States, they were not just isolated to Mexico, that they were, that these bands operated autonomously with from each other, and yet, they still spoke the same language, and they still, they still rolled together, and yet they could also, they could disagree on a lot of what those things would look like. And as we see, even as we saw in the 1830s, where they're not going to Mexico City to negotiate a treaty, they're going to Chihuahua. And in fact, they actually went to El Paso, which is even more fascinating because, again, El Paso, I mean, it's kind of, Isleta del Sur is, of course, it's, it exists there, and yet, the oral histories in that space of Comanche presences there are vibrant, and yet something that we don't hear about at all over there. So, anyways, thank you, Dr. Melendez. I really appreciate that.
Okay, we have time for one more, if anybody has one. All right, oh, yes.
Well, I had a question. You said that the Comanches were the first group to use the peyote as religion. And I was thinking about the Huicholes in Mexico. I'm wondering, you said that Comancheria extended down into San Luis Potosí.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering about the connection between...
That's, that is something that I would like to look into myself. I know that there have been, there's been a ton of work looking with Huicholes in particular, and with the peyote, and particularly kind of the migration, but also the pilgrimage that they have to take, right? But I'm not sure if I've seen any intersectional studies or comparative studies that are trying to link up Comanche peyote practices with those of the Huicholes. Obviously, I think precisely because they were pushing that far south, there was contact. There had to have been contact, and yet obviously, I also don't want to be kind of callous and saying, well, bueno, because they both did peyote, then of course they're the same, right? Because of course those communities had very different kind of histories and really and traditions of how they even relate to the plant as well. So, but yeah, I think I'm looking forward to diving into that more though. So thank you.